Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I did not buy the Winnebago because it was smart. I bought the 1989 Brave because the kids liked the fold-down table and the tiny loft bed, and because the furnace still worked when I tested it in the driveway in Columbus the first cold night of October. We planned to drive west to see Lisa's brother in Illinois and turn back before winter. We packed like people who believed in schedules, folded hoodies, a tin of coffee, board games, the dog-eared road atlas I insisted on keeping even though phones were supposed to replace books. I checked the belts, topped off coolant, aired the tires to the pressures printed on the door sticker, and crawled under the frame with a wire brush to make sure the battery ground strap was clean and tight. It felt like an old habit from my years as a paramedic. Do your checks before the call comes in. The call came in while I was on Channel 9 on the Citizens Band radio just to see if truckers still used it. Someone was describing fights at the rest area east of Dayton. Then the local news shifted monitors from traffic to a studio where the anchor's voice flattened and the crew said there were ongoing public safety incidents. The emergency alert tone sounded and the screen cut to a slate with a computerized voice advising us to remain indoors and avoid crowds. It did not use the word zombie. It did not have to. I have seen enough trauma to know when something is no longer a series of isolated events. We were already westbound on Interstate 70 when the channels began to go quiet. We passed a rear-end collision near Huber Heights. A state trooper with his lights on and his door open and nobody in the driver's seat. Lisa turned the radio down and said I should focus on the road. Abby, 9, was copying road signs into her notebook like she always did. Dylan, 13, was pretending to sleep with earbuds in. There was a band of high cloud and the kind of pale afternoon light that makes all the stubble fields look like brushed metal. It was late autumn in Ohio. The air had that damp smell of leaves in ditches and diesel from the westbound lanes. I kept my speed just below the limit because I did not like the pattern I was seeing. More cars pulled to the shoulder with hoods up. More trucks clustered in 2s and 3s. More people standing in the grass with their arms folded, looking at their phones like they were waiting for instructions. The emergency broadcast system returned every hour with the same message. The anchor rotation ended on every station. A scrolling advisory from the Department of Public Safety told us to avoid city centres and to shelter in place if we could. We were not in a house. We were in a 36-year-old mobile home with a carbureted V8 engine that had never liked cold starts. We discussed turning back, then we did not, because everywhere behind us looked worse. We made it as far as Springfield before the lanes tightened and then locked. A pair of delivery vans were mashed together at the base of an overpass, and beyond them were brake lights and a long crawl of stopped metal. I eased onto the shoulder and shut the engine off to save fuel. The air was quiet in a way highways are never quiet. That was when I saw the first injured man. He was stumbling between cars with both hands out, the way people do when they have lost equilibrium from a head injury. I would have gotten out with my trauma kit if he had looked like a normal patient. He did not. There was a glaze to his eyes that made me think of certain overdoses. He lunged at a woman who was climbing out of an SUV with a backpack. It was not a normal lunge. It was the kind of movement you see when the body is motivated by something simple and total, like heat or hunger. I locked the RV door and told Lisa to pull the blackout curtains we use for camping. Dylan sat up and asked what was happening. Abby put her pencil down and held my hand without asking any questions, which for her meant she already understood more than I wanted. We stayed quiet and watched. Another man staggered down the shoulder, bare feet grey with dust, turning his head as if listening for a noise. He stopped at our bumper and pushed a palm against the fiberglass. He was not begging, he was testing. That was the moment I understood the line between civil unrest and something else had been crossed. We heard sirens on the far side of the median, and then nothing. The line of cars thinned as drivers bumped across the grass to the frontage road. I did not want to risk getting the RV stuck in wet turf, so I waited until I saw a path that a delivery truck had made and followed the ruts. The Brave lurched but did not sink. I could feel the frame flex under my feet, the way old motorhomes do when you cross uneven ground. We came out onto a strip mall access and turned west again. We made it to a truck stop outside Springfield by late afternoon. The sun had lowered into the cloud layer and turned the whole parking lot a tired grey. I filled the tank because you always fill the tank when you can. I bought 2 5-gallon fuel containers because I could see the way the store clerk's hands were shaking, and I knew that simple things like pumps working are not guaranteed when the power grid is under stress. I bought canned food, iodine tablets, a second water filter, a pair of tarps, duct tape, bleach, and a roll of aluminum screening that would later save us more than once. Abby asked if she could have 1 bag of chips. I said yes. You make room for normal when you can. We found a spot along the outer edge of the lot, facing the access road. I leveled the RV by driving onto a pair of wooden blocks. I checked the propane level. I lit the furnace. I sealed the cab vents with duct tape and cut the tape edges neat so they would come off clean later. I installed the aluminum screening inside the side windows using self-tapping screws and small washers so the screen would not tear under strain. I cut pieces of heavy plastic from one of the tarps to fit inside each window frame and taped them in place with a perimeter of duct tape and then a crisscross so there would be no loose edge. I knew it would block the view. That was the point. I wanted the RV to look dark and empty. We left one small corner of the rear window uncovered so we could see the world. Lisa rigged the small string lights we always hang when we camp, but she clipped them to the underside of the cabinet lip so the glow would not be visible from outside. She had a way of making our temporary spaces feel careful rather than desperate. We slept in shifts the first night. I set my phone to wake me at 2 a.m. and again at 4:30 a.m. I sat in the driver's seat with the curtains pulled and watched the glass for movement. I kept the trauma kit on the floor and a fire extinguisher where I could reach it. You do not put a fire extinguisher away in a place where you cannot reach it in the dark. At 3:10 a.m., a sound carried across the lot that I thought was a coyote at first. Then I realized it was human. It was one note, sustained the way a person might sustain a single word if they had forgotten the rest of their language. I made the decision then to keep the kids off grass and out of stores, and to keep any walk outside time to daylight only. By morning, more vehicles had arrived, and some had left again. I counted 3 recreational vehicles, 2 fifth-wheel campers, and 8 or 10 sedans parked at odd angles. One of the drivers was talking through the half-open window of her car, as if there were a phone in her lap, repeating the phrase, "We'll be home soon," every 30 seconds. A pair of men in denim jackets were arguing about whether to drive on toward Dayton or head south on state roads. The emergency broadcast system repeated the same recorded segment on every channel. A cashier taped cardboard over one of the store windows because there was a spiderweb crack in the glass at shoulder height that had not been there the night before. We left at first light. I preferred dawn because most people are asleep or slow then. The fog that collects in the low parts of Ohio in late autumn had pulled between the gentle hills. Headlights made cones in it. I kept the RV speed to 45 miles per hour because stopping distances are long when brakes are wet and you are heavy. The road was not entirely ours. There were cars at odd angles and one tractor trailer that had drifted to the shoulder and put its right set of wheels into the soft gravel where it sank. The driver's door was open. There was a coffee cup on the step. The only movement was the fog. The first full day after the alert, we learned our pattern. We moved at dawn, found a place to sit tight by midday, and moved again in the last hour before evening. We withheld headlights whenever it was safe. We cut the engine rather than idle at long stops to save fuel. We ate cold food when running. The propane stove would have put scent into the air outside. We talked in normal voices inside the RV because there is no point in whispering in a small space, but we did not shout, and we did not open the door unless absolutely necessary. When we did open it, I went first with my hood up and gloves on, both to hide skin and to have something between me and any surface I did not trust. I made mental notes of sightlines whenever we stopped. Over time, this became reflex. Where is the highest spot? Where is an exit if the main one is blocked? Where is water? Where is a building that looks like a trap because it has only one door? We saw our first group of infected at a long curve west of Enon. They were spread across the median and shoulder, 5 or 6 of them. Nothing about them resembled the way a healthy person moves. One turned as if its neck were on a slow hinge, tracking the sound of our tires on pavement. I kept the engine note low and let gravity carry us through the bend. Lisa kept eyes on the group and talked in calm sentences, not because we needed to be calmer, but because she needed to account for each of them out loud. 2 by the sign, 1 near the guardrail, 1 on the center line. The one on the center line is turning. I could see the way Abby's pencil was pressed flat between her fingers, where she held it against her notebook without writing. We reached the outer ring of Dayton by late morning, and the highway stopped being a highway. There were burned patches in the grass at the interchanges and a couple of cargo vans with sliding doors open and nothing inside. We picked our way through at 5 miles per hour. I used the low gear, so I did not have to ride the brake. It is a good way to avoid panic when you're piloting something heavy. You focus on inputs and mechanical things, not on people standing on the shoulder watching you go by. We would not have met Jake if a refrigerated trailer had not jackknifed across our lane under an overpass, sealing it. I stood outside the RV with the hood up, so anyone watching would assume we were having engine trouble. I could see 3 options. There was a narrow gap of maybe 1.5 yards between the trailer bumper and the concrete abutment, but the curve of the guardrail made the approach tricky, and there was a post we would not clear. The grass sloped into a drainage ditch with standing water. The center median downhill was soft and would suck a 30-foot motorhome to the axles. I was tracing the angles with my hands when a man climbed down from the cab of a Kenworth on the far side and called over without stepping into the open. "You that Winnebago from the truck stop this morning?" he asked. "That was us," I said. He had the good sense to stay in shadow and keep his voice low. "Name's Jake," he said. "If you can give me 3 minutes with the bumper jack, we can swing this trailer 4 feet. He was not promising a miracle. He was describing something mechanical we could do with leverage. That was the kind of sentence I could trust. I carried the tool bag I'd put together from the garage before we left. Breaker bar, sockets, a small sledge, pry bar, ratchet straps, and the bottle jack I keep for tire changes. Jake had his own kit. A long-handled pry bar, a 4-foot cheetah pipe, and a chain rated for towing that he slung low so it would not clank. We positioned the jack at the trailer's rear corner, set cribbing under it so it would not sink, and I pumped the handle while he pulled a strap around the bumper and tied a trucker's hitch that would hold under strain. We did not talk about the people in the shadows. We heard soft footfalls across gravel and the kind of sound hungry animals make through their teeth. I kept my hands steady on the jack handle, and Jake kept his weight set against the strap so it would bite into the metal and not slide. When the corner came up 3 inches, I kicked the cribbing tighter and he shoved with a short, explosive movement that forced the bumper to swing on its trapped wheels. We did it again. We opened a slot I could see the Winnebago squeezing through if I aimed the right way and did not hesitate. "Take it now," he said, and I did. My shoulders were tight as I threaded the nose of the RV into the gap. The tires brushed the concrete. A scrape sounded from the rear corner. Then we were through, and Lisa was waving me forward. Jake jogged around and came through behind in his Kenworth, the kind of long-nosed tractor you do not see as often anymore. He had already cut off his chrome stacks at an angle and removed the decorative flaps. He was a practical man, rather than a proud one. I pulled onto the shoulder past the bridge and parked facing a narrow approach with a ditch on one side. He eased his rig into a spot that left him an escape route. I decided I wanted him with us for as long as he had the good sense to stay. We shared coffee in the RV with the curtains closed and only the small string light on. Jake kept his hat in his hands and thanked Lisa twice. He was 42, from Indiana, and had been hauling dry goods from a distribution centre north of Dayton when the company told them to park and wait for further instructions. He waited 3 hours and then started to move anyway because he knew what it meant when calls stopped coming. He was alone in his truck, which made him safer than most of the caravans we had seen. You get to choose people when you start with nobody. We travelled together after that. He used the Kenworth like a plough to push light cars off the lane when they blocked both lanes and there was no safe shoulder. He was careful where he put his front bumper. He learned quickly which cars would roll and which ones would not. He eased small sedans aside, but left heavy four-wheel drives where they were because you do not waste energy on something you cannot move. He kept his engine off and waited for me to clear turns, so we did not surprise each other. When he talked on the Citizens Band radio, he kept his words plain. We agreed to use Channel 19 because it was familiar and because hardly anybody else seemed to be using it anymore. We chose call signs even though it felt like playing at something. Brave one for us because the model name was stenciled on our nose, and Long Haul for him because it fit and he did not object. By the second night, we had a routine with Jake. We parked with our exits facing away from each other so neither of us would have to swing wide in front of the other to leave. We used the RV's onboard generator for a short window only, both to charge the battery bank and to run a small inverter welder I had bought years ago for fence repairs at the old house. The welder was not strong, but it was enough to tack steel mesh to the window frames and add scrap plate over the lower half of the windshield, leaving an eye-level slot that did not draw attention. I did cutting outside with a hacksaw and clamped each piece to a sawhorse to avoid the noise of a grinder. It took hours. The mesh came from a roll I found in a farm supply store. I cut it into rectangles and sandwiched it between the window frame and narrow strips of aluminum so the mesh would not pull free. Screws through those strips held the sandwich together. I tightened each screw by hand at the end so I would not strip the soft metal with a drill. It is the kind of work you do when your mind needs to think and your hands need a job. Lisa ran our water protocol like a classroom lab. She assigned Abby to log all intake in a lined notebook. She had Dylan boil water when the stove could be used without broadcasting our presence, and when it could not, she taught him to use iodine tablets, 2 tablets per quart, wait 30 minutes at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, wait longer if the water was colder or cloudy. She set a separate plastic bin for clean and dirty items and enforced a rule that nothing moved back the other way. She wiped door handles with a dilute bleach solution that smelled like the laundry room at the firehouse did on nights when we were caught up after a heavy call volume. She worked silently when she was angry or scared. I knew to leave her alone then, because that is when she did her best work. We did not pretend the children could be kept from the truth. We gave them jobs. Dylan learned to fly a small drone he had gotten for a birthday that was supposed to be a toy. He modified it with a zip-tied flashlight and a hook made from a bent tent stake. It could not lift anything, but it could carry a string. He used that string to pull twine across gaps when we needed a safety line for ourselves. He learned the battery life, the effective range, and how easily it was lost in wind. He learned that using it drew attention at night. He learned to launch from under overhangs so the motor noise was baffled, and the air above made a cushion that stabilized the first seconds of flight, Abby wrote. She drew maps with arrows. She recorded the time we started and stopped the engine, the fuel we added in gallons and in tick marks, the way the gauge seemed to translate. It kept her busy, and it left a record in case I did not make it to the end of any day. We learned things about the infected. They moved more when the sun was low. They were tuned to sound first and movement second. Glass muted sound more than I thought it would, and foam insulation panels muted it more than glass. They did not seem to understand reflections at night, which meant mirrors could be useful to us in a way they were not to them. They did not tire the way healthy people tire. If they tried a door and it did not open, they would sometimes stop trying and stand as if the question had confused them. If another sound started, they turned toward it the way cats turn toward wingbeat. I did not dwell on the cause. I cared only about patterns that could keep us alive, and off the lists of other people's stories. We made a fuel run we should not have made outside New Carlisle because our auxiliary containers were low, and I did not want to learn what it felt like to have the engine quit on a long, empty stretch. The station was one of those independent ones at an old intersection, 2 pumps and a small office with a rack of chips and a handwritten sign advertising bait in summer. The power was out, which meant the pump would not run from grid power. I knew some stations have manual crank pumps on their underground tanks. This one did not. Jake and I opened the cabinet on the pump and looked at the motor. It was a small electric unit bolted to the side of the hydraulic section. It had a standard 2-prong plug. The station's generator enclosure behind the building had a "Do not operate" sign wired to its lock. We cut the lock with a small bolt cutter. We did not do this because we liked taking things that were not ours. We did it because there are scenarios where everyone follows the rules and still lives, and there are other scenarios. The generator was a portable gasoline unit, rated for 5,000 running watts, with a surge capacity higher for a few seconds. I checked the oil, I checked the air filter, I checked the fuel. There was a half tank. I primed the carburetor and pulled the starter cord 3 times. The motor coughed and then caught. I let it warm for 60 seconds so the voltage would stabilize. I ran an extension cord around to the pump cabinet and plugged the motor in. When the pump started, I could feel the hairs on my arms lift in a way that had nothing to do with static. It was the sound of a magnet drawing metal. It drew them into the open from wherever they had tucked themselves away from daylight under awnings and behind dumpsters. Lisa was in the RV with the kids, and the curtains shut. Abby had her hands pressed on the table to keep from picking at her fingernails. Dylan watched the rear camera feed. They could see everything without making a sound. Jake had his truck crossways to shield the RV. He watched the street and counted under his breath. I filled the 2 auxiliary cans first and handed them to Dylan to slide onto the floor where they would not tip. Then I ran the hose into the RV's filler neck. It took a long time because the vent is small and this old system likes to burp vapor. I could hear footfalls over gravel now and the small inflected noises that came from throats that did not sing anymore. 2 on your right, Jake said from behind the corner of the building. 3 in the lot across the road, 1 on the sidewalk. Make it quick. I am making it quick, I said, and I was. But there are physics you cannot rush. I did not want to stop early and then need to do this again the next day in a worse spot. I watched the sight glass in the pump cabinet spin down to half. I heard knuckles on the generator housing. I had a flare in my back pocket for distraction. I pulled the cap and struck it against the rough strip, and the magnesium burned with a steady red light that would hold for a few minutes. I threw it hard into the street behind the store where the sound would bounce. The shapes turned to it. The pump handle clicked as the tank reached full, and the hose coughed. I cranked the valve shut, yanked the cord from the pump, and ran the extension around the corner, wrapping it on my arm as I went. Jake shut the generator off. The sudden quiet was like someone had taken their hand off the back of my neck. We moved before the attraction faded. We did not talk about luck when we got back inside. We did not want to teach the wrong lesson. We talked about planning. We talked about how we would not run the generator at night again unless we had a line of escape. We talked about why we would not make stops in towns with grid power out unless we had cover and at least 2 exits. We ate peanut butter straight from the jar and crackers with it. Lisa wrote our fuel run lessons on the first page of the notebook we treated as a manual. Never park under a light. Never park facing the pumps. Fill cans first. Leave the engine running when possible. If you must shut down, leave the key in and the door unlatched. Use flares for sound and light, not for fire. Never do anything that makes smoke you cannot stop. I made sure the kids read that page out loud to us and repeated it back in their own words. They did not roll their eyes. They had seen the shapes and heard the knuckles on the metal. The weather turned. The temperature at night dropped closer to freezing. On the second evening of the cold, a fog pushed up and over the low ground like a tide. We parked on a slight rise near a line of cottonwoods where the leaves had turned and were almost done falling. The highway there runs close to fields, and a frontage road loops off into a patch of light industry that was empty even before all this. We were near the state line, close enough that Indiana stations were the nearest ones still repeating the pre-recorded warnings. Their accents were flat in a way I found comforting, because it meant home was not far. We ran the RV furnace for only 20 minutes because propane is another thing you think you have enough of until you do not. We held our hands over the vents and then zipped our jackets and sat close. Abby asked if we were going to keep going to Indianapolis. I said we would keep moving west until we found a good place to stop for more than a day. Jake had a map that showed a rest area near Richmond, Indiana, with a state police post attached. I knew some of those have storm shelters beneath them for tornado seasons. The rumor on the radio before the radio went quiet was that the Richmond rest area had one. That meant two things. It might be safe, or it might be packed with people who had found it first. We sleep planned it the way paramedics sleep plan a long night. We talked through triage, posted duty assignments, and set an alarm every 90 minutes so I could look out through the small slit at the base of our windshield armor. It is easier to sleep in small pieces when you know somebody else is looking between yours. We entered Indiana in the first light of a cloudy dawn. The sign that says Crossroads of America threw back our headlights without enthusiasm. The road was worse here. More vehicles abandoned at odd angles. More interstate medians with ruts cut through them. We saw a car at the bottom of a retention pond off the right shoulder with an air pocket under the roof and a handprint marking the glass. We did not stop. You cannot stop for every story. You stop for the stories that intersect yours directly and for which you have the tools and the time to change the outcome. Anything else is a good way to break your own line. Before Richmond, the highway bends and rises slightly. At the top of that rise, we saw the reason traffic had thinned so much. There was a pile-up that looked like it had started as one truck losing control and then ended as 50 vehicles trapped between tanks of steel with no way out. We made a plan in 3 parts. I would scout the right edge on foot, with Dylan flying the drone 30 feet above me, far enough to be quiet, but close enough that I could see what the camera saw on the small display. Lisa and Abby would remain in the RV with the engine off, and the key turned back to accessory, so the steering wheel would not lock if they had to move it a few feet, using the starter only. Jake would use the Kenworth to block a line of approach on the left, so nothing could run along the guardrail and surprise us. The fog pooled in the low spots in the metal, like it had in the fields. I moved along the right, testing the ground with my boot before each step, because there were cables and straps and plastic fragments that could tangle feet. The drone hummed above me and cast a small cone of light that shook a little when the air moved. I found a path. It was not a path the Winnebago would enjoy, but it was a path that could be made if we stacked rubber mats over a riprap shoulder and shored the soft piece with scrap lumber and a couple of broken pallets. I waved and Dylan brought the drone down to land on the roof of the RV like a bird that finally trusted the branch. We stacked and braced, and then we went. The RV crawled at a walking pace with the tyres just inside the line of the stacked mat. I let the transmission idle in first gear and did not touch the throttle or brake. Jake stood at the right front corner and gave me hand signals the way we used to on ambulance calls when backing into tight hospital bays. Palm flat to slow, 2 fingers together to move left, fist to stop. We were halfway through when the noises started from inside the pile of vehicles. They were not sudden. They were like distant, soft conversation without words. The fog moved in lace behind broken glass. Then forms pressed against windows and the glass bowed. "Keep coming," Jake said. His voice did not change tone. Just a few feet more. We did not speed up. We kept exactly the speed we could control completely. Control is more important than speed in tight work. We came out on the far side and I let the RV roll down the slight grade before I gave any throttle so we would not spin a wheel on the last bit of slick. Jake followed with the Kenworth, easing the trailer wheels across the same stacked mats, not because the weight needed it, but because the habit of using what you built is a way to respect the work. We stopped at the top of the next rise to breathe, rather than because we needed to. Lisa opened the small vent above the stove and let the air cycle twice before she shut it. Abby told me she had recorded the time it took to place the mats. and that it had been 9 minutes and 24 seconds. I told her that was good to know. Dylan said the drone had picked up movement in the vehicles we had passed on the shoulder, and that 4 had turned their heads as our engines changed pitch. He had numbers for everything. I asked him to put those numbers in the margin of Abby's map, with small circles around them. There is comfort in the idea that your own handwriting can hold a shape that keeps away the panic. We reached the Richmond rest area just after noon. The parking lot was a scatter of cars, many with doors hanging open. The building's doors were propped with plastic bins. The vending machines were empty, and one had been levered open with a tool that had chipped the tile floor. The bathrooms had been used, but not properly. There were signs of life that should have been encouraging but were not, because the signs were disordered. There was a state police office attached to the rest area, the kind where troopers write reports and handle minor accidents. Its door was closed. We looked for a sign of a shelter entrance and found a metal hatch set in the ground, behind the building where the mechanical rooms usually are. The hatch handle had a padlock on it, and the padlock had been cut. The hatch was closed again but not latched. I put my ear to it and heard nothing except the kind of echo you get from empty concrete chambers. We made a decision to check the shelter because we needed a place to rest that was not a vehicle, and because if there were people down there, they would need us or we would need them. We did it our way. Jake stood at the top of the hatch with a pry bar. I opened it slowly and held it only a few inches at first, not because I expected something to rush out, but because if there is pressure or a trap, an extra second can be the difference between a bad surprise and a bad outcome. Cool air rose from the stairs. There was a light switch at the top with tape over it, the kind of tape you put to keep someone from being tempted to use power that will draw attention. We left the switch off. Dylan lowered the drone. The camera showed a corridor with cinder block walls and laminated posters about tornado safety. It showed a door at the end with the words "storage" stenciled on it. It did not show people. We went down as a team, me first, then Lisa, then Abby, then Dylan, then Jake last because he was best at closing heavy things behind him and because he understood how to use a hallway. We moved with our lights pointed low because light on the floor gives you enough to see without telling anyone outside exactly where your head is. We checked rooms in a clockwise pattern because consistency with search patterns means you do not miss doors. We found a storage room with cases of water bottles and boxes of blankets and some first aid supplies that had not been taken. We took what we needed and repacked the shelf with the rest, so it would not look looted in the way that invites attention. We did not find people. We did not find bodies. We found a children's book on a bench and a coffee cup with lipstick on the rim. We found a note written in block letters that said, "Went north at first light." There was a date on it from 4 days before. The writing was careful and steady. I wanted to believe the hand that wrote it was still steady. We could have stayed down there. There was water, there were walls, there were heavy doors I could have braced with plywood strips and a handful of lag bolts. But the ventilation system relied on fans that were not running anymore. Air gets old fast in a space not designed for long stays without power. We would have been breathing in our own exhale by midnight and guessing at carbon dioxide levels with matches. I have done that test before in basements during storm blackouts. If the flame bends away from your mouth when you blow gently across it, your exhale is concentrated enough to make the room unkind. There are better instruments for that kind of work, but good instruments were in the labs and trucks that were sitting in parking lots going cold. We took a different lesson from the rest area. It was a place with cover and angles. It had back doors and a mechanical yard with a chain link fence that could be reinforced. It had water from the restroom tanks, even if the taps were dry. It had a place to park with the RV's nose pointed at an exit. We spent the afternoon there doing our small chores the way normal people clean a house on a weekend, checking tyres, pulling leaf clogs from the cowl vents, tightening the loose screw on the stovetop that rattled when the engine idled. Jake changed a headlight bulb on the Kenworth, with the kind of care you usually only see in a shop, not on the side of a road. Lisa cleaned counters. Abby taped our maps together with clear tape so the seams made a larger field when unfolded. Dylan found a clock with hands on the wall of the state police office and wound it. We listened hard for anyone who might come back. We kept our profiles small. We did not light anything we did not need. The first real test of our rolling fortress came that night. The fog thickened and the air temperature fell below 40. The diesel in Jake's truck would gel if we did not treat it, so he poured in an anti-gel he had stashed behind his seat and ran the engine for 2 minutes to circulate it. The sound pulled 3 silhouettes out of the line of trees at the edge of the parking lot. They moved with the steady cadence we had learned means they were not testing the air. They were coming to the sound. Jake shut down. We waited. One of them moved along the side of the state police building, running a hand along the brick. Another paused at the door we had propped earlier and pushed it with the heel of a palm. The door moved an inch and then stopped against the block I had wedged at the base. It made a hollow sound that carried in the fog. I learned something from the way they worked that door. They did not attempt to solve the wedge. They did not look down. They simply pressed at chest height until the effort felt wrong, then moved on. I made a mistake then. I thought I could draw them away with the flare trick and then sleep. I lit one and tossed it into the far edge of the lot. It was not a bad plan in itself. The mistake was not accounting for sound reflected off the building. The flare hissed and drew 2 of them, but the sound also bounced back and pulled one toward us. He came to the RV's windshield and pressed his face against the slit at the base of the plate I had bolted on. His breath fogged the glass. I could see that his eyes had the glassy look I had noticed in the first man we saw on the highway. I did not think about what had put that look there. I thought about the glass and the fasteners and the wavelength of the sound his breath made when it moved over the edge of the plate. I thought about the mesh on the side windows and the points at which the screws might pull under load. He tapped the metal with his knuckles. The hollow sound made Abby flinch. Dylan put his hand on her wrist and held steady. Lisa looked at me with the kind of question you ask when you already know the answer. We waited. We did not start the engine. We did not speak. We did not tap back. The flare burned down to a dim coal and then to nothing. He stood another minute and then went where the others went, which was toward a noise far off across the highway, where someone else had started an engine and then shut it off. I cannot know their reasons. I can only report what I saw. When presented with 2 sounds, they went toward the most recent. This is a detail that became the foundation of more than one plan later. We left the rest area before dawn. I left a note of our own in the shelter corridor, written in careful block letters and dated. It said, "We took water, eastbound not safe, westbound slow but passable. We are moving toward higher ground and fuel." I do not know if anyone read it. I know the act of writing it felt like an agreement with myself that we were still the kind of people who leave signs that help. West of Richmond, the road straightens and flattens. The fog that loves low ground drifted like smoke across the stubble fields. We kept our speed at a careful 40 because we were passing clusters of vehicles more often than single ones. Jake used his truck to nose a mid-sized sedan off the shoulder so we could take a wider line through a curve. He did it slow, like moving furniture in a neighbor's house. There was a broken traffic camera pole lying on its side with wires exposed. A small herd of deer stood in the median, ears forward, unsure whether the change in human noise meant they were safer or less safe. The sky lifted a little, not to blue, but to a higher grey, and we all felt better for no reason, other than that we could see a quarter mile instead of 100 yards. We set our sights on an industrial park that showed on the map with a symbol for a water tower. Water towers mean 2 things: a high vantage point if you are willing to climb, and a tank you might draw from if the valves are accessible and you know how to prime a pump. The park was a collection of long, low buildings with loading docks and a perimeter road. We circled once to check for movement. We chose a building with dock doors that faced away from the highway and a row of trees that broke the wind. There was a man door with a narrow window. I pushed the handle. It moved and then hit a deadbolt. I pried the metal leaf near the latch with a flat bar and bent it enough to slip in a shim and lift the latch bolt. This is a thing you can practice at home with scrap and ought not to have to use. That day, I was glad I had practiced. Inside, the building smelled like cardboard and engine oil. There was a forklift parked with its keys on a hook. There were pallets of shrink-wrapped boxes labelled with part numbers and nothing else. There was a utility room with a sink that did not run, but a hose bib that did. The water came sluggish at first, and then steadier. I filled our containers and flushed the hose until the water ran clear and gave no off smell. I added a measured teaspoon of bleach per 5 gallons to be safe, and wrote the time on tape on each container so we would not forget how long it had sat. We moved the RV inside and shut the dock door behind us and blocked it with a pallet jack. For 2 hours, we had a space that felt like a garage. For 2 hours, we were people who could sit on the step of a motorhome and drink coffee in the smell of cut cardboard and oil. That was when I fixed what had been bothering me since the first night, the weakness of the windshield. I cut 2 sheets of galvanized steel to match the lower half and overlapped them with the mesh already in place. I drilled small holes along the top edge and through the pillars and set bolts with washers in a pattern that would spread load. I left a horizontal view slot that was 4 inches high and as wide as the glass, then mounted a hinged flap of mesh inside that we could raise and lower on a simple cord. If anything pressed on the outside, the mesh would spill the force across the bolts instead of tearing the screws out of plastic. I knew it was not proof against every attempt. I knew it would buy us time. Lisa reorganized our food into 3 categories: ready to eat, heat needed, and stove not required. She put ready-to-eat items in a bin by the table and taped a list to the lid so anyone could grab without asking. She began to ration the sweet things back, not because we were low yet, but because sugar is a good way to teach kids that you are giving up pieces of normal life. She explained this to them exactly that way. She did not use metaphors. She said, "I'm going to set these aside. We will bring them out when someone has a birthday or we have a hard day." Abby understood. Dylan pretended to roll his eyes and then did not. The kids slept for an hour after that because their bodies needed to. Jake sat on the step and drank coffee and told me about his wife and son near Muncie and how he had not been able to reach them after the first day. He said he was not going to do anything stupid to try to get there if it put our convoy at risk, because he was not going to make one loss into 2. I told him we would angle north when it was safer so he could try. He nodded without thanking me because thanks would have made a promise out of it. The unspoken agreement was better. We would keep moving west until we found higher ground or a place with power that did not depend on the grid and fences tall enough to keep hands from reaching through. We did not yet know what that place would look like. We knew it would not look like a city. We had to leave the industrial park because silence is not a plan. The longer you stay, the more likely someone else finds you, and the larger the group, the more likely someone makes a mistake. We rolled out at dusk and the fog lifted one last time before dark. We came into the outskirts of a small town whose name I did not know, even though I have driven through on trips before. The main street had a diner with aluminum trim that reflected the little light left and made the place look alive. We did not stop because places that look alive attract people who still think they can buy coffee and the paper there. We took the bypass and crossed the Whitewater River on a concrete bridge that hummed under the RV's tyres. I could see a fishing access on the far bank with a gravel lot where we could have parked. We did not, because the river's cut carried sound, and I'd begun to think like prey. We camped that night on a farm lane a half-mile off the interstate, behind a disused silo that knocked the wind down. We set an alarm every 90 minutes and took turns. Jake took the darkest hour without being asked. He stood with his back to the Kenworth's hood and his eyes at the horizon, hands in his jacket pockets. He looked like a man waiting for the first sign of dawn. I lay on the bed with Lisa's hand against my forearm and listened to our children breathe. The furnace clicked on at 2:10 a.m. and again at 4 a.m. and the sound did not pull anything to us because the door seals were good and the air was still. I slept 20 minutes at a time and woke clear, my mind assembling a list. Check torque on the bolts tomorrow, Swap the left front tyre to the right rear to even wear. Consider adding sandbags over the rear axle for traction on wet grass. Teach Dylan how to dump the grey water tank without stepping in the runoff. Show Abby how to check propane level by pouring warm water down the side of the tank and feeling where the temperature changes. By the 5th day, we had a system. In the mornings, Lisa reviewed our supplies and assigned tasks. Dylan flew the drone only at dawn and dusk when the motor noise would blend with wind. Abby updated the map and wrote a paragraph in her notebook about something specific, like the way fog collects on corn stubble, or how a fuel pump motor sounds compared to a generator. Jake made our path with the Kenworth when it needed making and otherwise kept station behind us, so the RV was never mid-pack. I drove. I watched for the signs that mattered now, glints that meant glass in the road, shadows that meant ditches, crows that meant meat that would attract things we could not risk meeting. We had 2 human encounters that week. The first was a family in a minivan at the side of the road with the hood up. They had a cardboard sign that said, "Water please." The father lifted it when we approached. The little boy held his mother's belt loop with both hands. The mother's mouth was set in a line that was familiar to me because I had seen it on Lisa's face when one of our kids had a fever as a baby. I pulled the RV to a stop a car length away and kept the engine idling. I told them to stay where they were, and I would set a container on the pavement and back away. The father nodded. I set a 2-gallon jug underhand and slid it so it would not tip. He said thank you without asking for more. I asked if anyone was sick. He shook his head and kept his hands visible. I believed him. He did not ask to come with us. He would not have refused if I had offered. I did not offer because every person we added doubled the chance that a mistake would cascade. This is not a thing I say lightly. It is a thing I say because the math of groups is cruel. The second was a pair of men in a pickup who tried to pace us and then cut ahead to block the lane, thinking we were carrying fuel or food we would trade. Jake saw them before I did and moved the Kenworth to the centre line so they would think again. They did not think again. They stopped crossways and one of them lifted a pipe. I did not wait to see if the pipe had been intended as a lever or a threat. I steered around them into the grass and trusted the RV's ground clearance and our speed. The tyres sank and then bit. The body rocked and the plates over the windshield made a sound that was somewhere between a rattle and a groan. We came back up onto the pavement 100 yards ahead and kept going. In the mirror, Jake set his horn off, not as a show of temper, but as a message that could be heard from a distance. Do not follow. The pickup did not. We did not talk about it because we did not need to teach the children how to be angry. We needed to teach them how to be consistent. We had a plan to reach the western side of Indianapolis by the end of the week, skirt the worst of the city, and look for a county fairground or a water plant with a chain-link perimeter where we could park for more than a day. Plans in this world are like lines drawn in pencil. You can erase them at any point with a finger if the real world presses against them. On the day we were supposed to skirt the city, the fog came back thicker than before, and the temperature dropped another 5 degrees. And the hint of ice in the air taught me something I had not thought about yet. A cold snap would bring the infected out during hours we had thought safer. We saw movement before dawn. We heard impact on a fence at 5:20 a.m. and the sound carried sharp. We decided not to approach the bypass there. We made a longer loop on county roads that looked like veins on the map and like tunnels between stands of bare trees when you were inside them. It cost us 4 hours. It kept us from being part of a pile of sheet metal under one of those long multi-lane interchanges where exits stack on exits. I choose time over risk now without apology. We found our first real shelter 2 days later in a place we did not expect to. It was a solar testing facility north of a small town. The kind of place where companies install stacks of panels at different angles and put sensors on them to measure output. It had a chain-link fence 10 feet high with a small barbed wire top. It had a gate I could lift off its hinges after cutting one stubborn weld with a hacksaw. It had inverters in a metal building and a battery bank in a climate-controlled room. And most important, it had been built with the kind of fail-to-safe engineering that meant the panels were still making power and the batteries were still accepting it even though the grid was down. The lights in the office did not come on because the switches were off and the contactors were locked out for safety. I pulled the lockout tags and threw the main and the office lights clicked. I shut them back off immediately because light is an announcement. I left one small indicator in the battery room so we could see the charge level in numbers rather than guessing from voltage. Numbers are better because they make arguments short. We parked inside the fence with the RV's nose toward the gate and Jake's truck crosswise as a battering ram if needed. We walked the perimeter and checked for low spots and pushed rocks under the bottom of the gate so it would not have a gap you could slide a foot under. We backed the RV to within 10 feet of the battery building so we could run a heavy cable and charge our house bank without running the generator. We used power sparingly even then, an hour to charge devices, 10 minutes to run the microwave so Lisa could heat one small meal for the kids, 2 minutes at a time to run water in the office bathroom to flush if the tanks in the roof still had pressure. We did not turn on the outside lights at all. The sun would power our quiet life by day. By night, we would be another shadow. The first evening there, Samantha would have filmed the sunset if Samantha had been a person in our story. Instead, Abby drew it as a band of pencil lines, getting lighter toward the horizon, and wrote the words, "Quiet Power" under it. Dylan walked the rows of panels with Jake and listened to him talk about mechanical things because the sound of their voices inside the fence felt like something old and safe. Lisa stood with her hands on her hips and looked at the office building and calculated in her head how many rolls of shelf paper she would need to make the counters easy to keep clean. I set a piece of plywood on sawhorses and lined up tools on it like a workbench. I have learned you can get through a lot if you keep your little area orderly. We had to test our perimeter on the third night. The moon came up late and the fog came up early, and for an hour the air glowed with a diffuse light that made every panel row look like a line of empty frames. Something moved at the fence on the south side. The fence wires sang in that distinctive way chain link does when weight is put on it. We did not run toward the sound. We went to our posts, Jake at the gate with a pry bar in case the latch needed to be forced, me at the battery building to cut power if there was a fault that could set fire, Lisa at the RV door to get the kids inside with head counts, Dylan climbing the ladder to the roof with the field glasses, Abby with the notebook on the table, ready to write what we saw in words that would be useful later. The pressure on the fence stayed for a minute and then slid away. The sound moved along the line toward the corner and then was gone. In the morning, we found handprints in the dew at the top rail, but no cut wires and no bent posts. The fence had held because chain link has a kind of give that makes climbing frustrating if you do not know how. I did not celebrate that fact. I wrote in our manual, "Fences buy time. They do not solve problems." We did not plan to live there forever. We planned to live there long enough to exhale and take stock and decide whether to attempt a route north for Jake or farther west to a place with fewer roads and more distance between things. We made lists and put dates on them because the calendar makes sense even when nothing else does. We rotated tyres on the RV with the jack and cribbing and taught Dylan how to take the weight on the jack stand and then let it down in half turns. We serviced the Kenworth's fuel filters because diesel parts gel when the cold comes and you need clean flow to keep the engine from stumbling. We printed a list of frequencies on a sheet of paper and taped it by the Citizens Band radio in case we heard any organised broadcasts start up again. We set a rule that we would not transmit unless necessary. Receivers are quiet, transmitters announce. On the fifth morning at the solar facility, we woke to a sky like blank paper and a frost that made the grass wires. The panel rows glittered. The battery room showed charge at 80%. I made oatmeal with the propane stove and the kids ate it without asking for sugar because they were learning what ease costs. I radioed to Jake that I wanted to scout the perimeter beyond the fence in daylight for routes in and out. He answered with a click and then copy because we keep our radio words short. Lisa packed a small bag with gauze, tape, antiseptic, ibuprofen, and a printed sheet that reminded you how to use them in case the person needing the supplies was not the person who usually did that job. Abby drew the map of our fence on one page and left the next page blank for notes. Dylan checked the drone batteries and put them in his jacket inside pocket so the cold would not cut their life in half. We walked the fence line, and then the ditch that ran along the county road, and then the field beyond. We found a maintenance access road that would allow the RV to exit without going back to the highway. We found a culvert with frozen water in it that would crack loudly when stepped on, and so should be avoided at night. We found an abandoned pickup with a tool chest in the bed that had 2 good breaker bars, a set of metric sockets, and a weathered first aid kit with supplies different from ours. A triangular bandage, a mouth barrier for rescue breathing, and 2 foil blankets that would be useful for conserving heat if someone were wet. We took them and left a note under the chest lid that said what we had taken and where we had gone. It cost nothing to leave that information. It might save someone's temper later when they realized a stranger had been through their stuff. Anger is wasted fuel. On the way back, we saw a thin column of smoke on the horizon toward the interstate, where a line of dead weeds had been set alight by a careless flare or a spark from a dragging muffler. We heard sounds carry in a way they do when cold and still. A shout, the pop of a small engine, a metallic bang that could have been a truck door. We decided that staying another day would be a mistake. The fog would lift and carry noise farther. The sound of our leaving would be just another piece of sound in a morning full of it. We packed the RV with a practiced order. We coiled cords and wired down loose things and latched cabinet doors. Lisa washed the 2 mugs we had used and put them where they belong, handle to the right, because that is the way they had always been. It mattered to keep some detail under our own control. We rolled out at mid-morning and took the maintenance road to a county line that ran parallel to the interstate but felt a world away. The kids counted hawks on poles as if we were on a normal Sunday drive. Jake tuned the radio to a frequency he had used when he hauled wind turbine parts years ago because he said the people who worked those jobs were practical and sometimes still used the old channels. We did not hear voices. We heard only the soft static of distance and the steady drone of our own engine at 2,000 revolutions per minute, the kind of sound I will hear in my sleep when I am an old man, if I survive to be one. In the end, our story did not have a single ending. It had a series of smaller ones every day when we made it to dusk, and a spot with cover and a clear exit. It had a larger arc that took us across Indiana and into Illinois, and then farther west, until the fog of the Ohio Valley was a memory, and the land opened into wider distances that made us feel less watched. Along the way, we marked our maps with notes like, good water, do not stop, and might be safe in winter. We left short letters in places we thought other people might check. Fuel pump manual, generator works, water in utility room, bleach in cabinet, gate hinge lifts, do not cut. We stayed in motion because motion was the only power we owned that could not be taken by a switch somewhere we did not control. There were nights when we slept 6 hours, and nights when we did not sleep at all because something pushed on the mesh and we watched it and waited for it to stop, and then discussed our adjustments in low voices and wrote them down. There were days when we ate cold canned beans with the lid bent back, and days when Lisa warmed food and the kids put their elbows on the table like they had at home, and it felt almost like a kitchen. There were mornings when the fog pressed so close to the windshield slot that it felt like driving inside a cloud of breath, and afternoons when the sun came out and heated the plates on the windshield, and the smell of warm, galvanized metal made the inside of the RV smell like a barn in summer. We kept our rules and added to them. We never used a shortcut we had not walked. We never parked head in. We never opened a door with our bare hands if we could loop a strap and pull from a distance first. We never raised our voices. We never repeated a route 2 days in a row. We never lit more than one small light at a time after dark. We never made promises to strangers that we could not keep. We never made promises to each other that depended on other people to fulfill. Sometimes I think about the first man we saw on the highway with his hands out like he was trying to measure the air. I wonder whether he was someone's father or uncle or neighbour who used to mow his lawn in clean diagonal lines. I do not dwell on it. Pity is a luxury like sugar in coffee. You take it when you have margin. You go without it when you do not. The kids learned the same way we did, by doing the next needed thing. Dylan became a scout. Abby became our historian. Lisa became a quartermaster and a teacher and a partner whose sense of what is necessary kept me from doing stupid things just to feel strong. Jake became the friend I trusted to sit the 3 a.m. watch, which is the kind of trust you build by turning wrenches and not wasting words. We never found the people who left the note in the Richmond shelter. We found other notes in places where no one had bothered to sweep the sand off the floor or turn the chairs right side up. We added ours. We did not write good luck. We wrote facts. Facts are the only kindness that does not run out. People sometimes ask in stories like this whether we ever found a place to settle for good. The honest answer is that for good is a phrase that belongs to the world we left at the Springfield truck stop. We have found places that were good for a week and one that was good for 2. We have not found a place that does not require vigilance. The mobile home that once was a way to take our kids to see their uncle became a moving shelter that we could seal in minutes and drive away from danger in seconds. It became our only constant, a rectangle of aluminum and plywood and bolted mesh that contained 4 people and our rules, and the sound of a dog-eared atlas sliding on the table in turns. It became my symbol of a promise I made to my family the first night when the hollow tapping of knuckles on steel made the hairs on my arms rise. We will keep moving. We will keep our heads. We will not waste ourselves. On a morning when the fog was thin and the air smelled like dry leaves, and the interstate ahead was empty in a way I will never forget, we drove west into a pale light that reminded me of the lights of a hospital corridor at dawn. In the mirror, I could see Jake's Kenworth pacing us, a steady rectangle in the lane behind. Abby drew a small map of that moment and wrote, "Home isn't where you live, it's what you keep moving." I would have used different words, because I am a person who likes specifications and talk values and lists of supplies. Her sentence was better. It was precise in the way a child's description can be when they have seen enough to understand what matters and decide to name only that. We kept moving. The world behind us burned in places and smoked in others and lay quiet in many more. The radio stayed mostly silent, except for our check-ins and the occasional fragment of a broadcast that had been looped and forgotten by whoever had started it. We moved not because we thought there was a finish line, but because moving meant we could pick our spots. And picking your spots is the difference between a life you can bear and a life that bears down on you. When the fog returned in the low ground, we slowed and let the engine note drop until it was barely more than the sound of tyres on concrete. The mobile home glided through like a ship over a still lake. We were 4 people in a rolling shelter, with a friend behind us in a truck built to move weight. It was not hope, not exactly. It was something quieter and more durable. It was the practice of doing the next right thing, with care, again and again, until the road opened a little and you could see enough to turn your head and say to the person next to you, "This is good enough for now," and believe it. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.